be seen, you are welcome to keep your camera off, although we do invite you, for those who would like to turn your camera on so we can also see you for our call today. Uh, the recording will be available afterwards on our social media pages, including on YouTube for viewing and sharing. And we hope you will help us to spread this widely because, as Anu mentioned, it's a very interesting topic, and we have a great lineup of speakers today with some insights I think that are vital in these moments of change and uncertainty on the global stage. Now, I believe we are live streaming, so without further ado, we'll get started with today's session. Today, our webinar is called Continuity and Changes in Imperialism and Resistance. The name is more or less self-explanatory, but we have a brief description alongside it, really focusing on the international system being in a moment of transition, both economic and social, of course, also geopolitical changes that we're seeing on the world stage, with the US-led West facing significant challenges, both internally and externally, and in particular from states like China and throughout Asia, with significant economic and military blocks of power. There are new multilateral regional alliances such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and ASEAN, which in the region present a very different path, distinct from NATO, for the relations between states. The US and its allies are currently carrying out a genocide in Gaza, even with the so-called Trump peace plan. We prefer not to use the term peace so much in there, but the genocide is to this day continuing on. And meanwhile, also the US seeks to restructure West Asian and destabilize several countries within the global South. On the global stage, we also see a moment of polycrisis, of overlapping crises and problems that are deepening inequality, climate change, accelerating, and further ecological setbacks, identity conflicts, and of course, wars, armed conflicts, and just under the surface conflicts that have not yet gotten to the point of a full-blown war. Within this situation, the US is seeking a sort of comeback as the dominant hegemon through its aggressive imperialist practices. People worldwide continue to demonstrate against the actions of the US and its allies, particularly around the besieged people of Palestine, and opposing the imperial policies of militarism and exploitation across every corner of the world. The question we have for today's webinar is, how should people's movements in Asia, Latin America, and Europe view these events and react to them? The webinar will unpack this current situation, but also connect the dots between these different regions and the different crises that we're facing to analyze the trends and also identify some ways forward. The session today is co-organized by the Asia-Europe People's Forum, which is an interregional network of progressive civil society organizations across Asia and Europe. Since 1996, the AEPF has consistently been networking as a link between Asian and European NGOs and social movements. It's committed to fostering people's solidarity for a social and economically just, inclusive, peaceful, sustainable, and ecologically sensitive development within and across the two regions, Asia and Europe. It has 6 thematic clusters in which it works, including climate change and just transitions, social justice and reclaiming affordable and quality public services, trade justice and corporate accountability, food sovereignty and resource justice, peace and security, and participatory democracy, reclaiming rights and fundamental freedoms. The International Peace Bureau is one of the world's oldest international peace networks. Founded in 1891 and Nobel Peace Laureate from 1910, the IPB has, across its over 130 years of history, sought to bring movements for peace across the world together, to raise up a global voice for peace and justice, and to network for disarmament, for abolition of nuclear and other dangerous weapons and to find solidarity amongst peoples for peace around the world. With all of this in mind, then, we have, as mentioned before, a great lineup of speakers today. The first that we have is Professor Achin Vinayak, who's a retired professor, a fellow of TNI, and a scholar activist from India. We have Dr. Dharini Rajasingham Senanayake, and please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing any of the names here, and feel free to correct me. Uh, she is a Sri Lankan cultural, political, and medical anthropologist with extensive expertise in the international development industry and has taught at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Then we also have Christophe Agueton, who is a French intellectual and trade unionist with Transform. And finally, we have Gabriel Aguirre, who's the Latin American organizer for World Beyond War from Venezuela and based in Bogota. He has been an activist and advocate for peace, social justice, and international solidarity and human rights, and has more than 13 years of experience in social and community work. So, with our great lineup of speakers, we will start with Professor Achin Vinayak, who will speak on the current trends of politics and economic trends of imperialism. Professor Achin, the word is over to you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I will speak, give a kind of overview of how imperialism has changed over the centuries in many ways. Let me start with two basic aspects of what constitutes imperialism. First one, the primary agent of imperialism is the state. Multinationals, etc., may be conduits, beneficiaries, assistants and all, but states are what constitutes imperialism. We talk of imperialist states. Second, of course, when we talk about imperialism, we are talking about the attempt or the exercise of domination beyond one's own territory over other areas, over other territories and peoples here. In pre-modern times, imperialism meant the forcible military expansion over territories and peoples for various reasons, tribute, getting hold of land, and so on. And of course, setting up hierarchical vassal states and empires and so on. This aspect of forcible military expansion beyond one's territory remains to this day and is a crucial characteristic of imperialism. But in modern times, in capitalist times, what happens is that imperialism, the forms of imperialism are more variable, indirect, and different in so many ways. The economic dimension comes in. So, for example, in the early, middle 19th century, Britain, the dominant imperialist power, carried out capitalist colonization of lands, but there was also the imperialism of free trade, which Britain exercised against, say, Latin America. And then, because capitalism means competition between different capitalists, this also means that there is competition between different countries. And what happens later on, of course, is that the late industrializers, Germany, Tsarist Russia, Japan, and so on, start fighting against the early industrializers to actually expand. And that was the period, if you like, of inter-imperialist rivalry that led to two world wars. After this Second World War, you have the former imperialist powers aligning themselves with the super-imperialism of the United States, but now confronted by newly independent, decolonized countries, and of course, a bloc of countries that was not capitalist. And it is in this context that the United States becomes dominant and, of course, tries to set up the constitutional framework for the expansion of capitalism everywhere, because capitalism must try and expand everywhere. However, this competition between capitalism also, as I said, leads to contestation. And when you then move towards neoliberal capitalist globalization and the collapse of the communist bloc, then for the first time in the world became essentially capitalist throughout. Unevenly so, but nevertheless, that kind of capitalism. And you began to have countries that were growing and becoming more influential and stronger and fighting among each other. And this, particularly after the 2008 crisis, meant that the earlier sort of constitutional framework for the operation of capitalism. What I mean by constitutional framework is IMF, World Bank, WTO, because states have to stabilize and coordinate both at the domestic level and at the international level. They have to provide the legal framework, they have to provide the social framework, they have to provide the administrative framework, they have to arbitrate between different capitals, and of course, they have to use coercive power, especially against those who suffer from the continuity of capitalism. Yeah. So you had this kind of a situation, but what has happened is that more and more countries became stronger, and even as they coordinated and cooperated, they also competed with each other. And today, we have, in fact, what I would say are three key imperialist powers. People talk about the multipolarity that is emerging, but even those who talk about that also point to tripolarity. And these three, in my view, imperialist powers, of course, Russia, China, and the United States, of course, uneven in strength. The United States is much stronger. But why do I say that they are imperialists? I say they're imperialists because they cannot be bullied and they are not dominated by any other force or any other power. They may be weak in here, but they are not dominated. They are not cannot be pushed around in the way that other countries can and other states can. Below them, however, come a set of countries that I would call sub-imperial powers or regional imperialist powers or aspiring imperialist powers that also behave imperialistically in certain ways. And these are countries like Turkey, like India. I would say that Britain and France today, unlike in the past, are regional imperialist powers. And of course, you have Israel, you have countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Brazil, some would say South Africa, and so on. Why do I say that these are sub-imperial powers? Because one, they do try to and do exercise different levels of domination over a certain range of territory and countries, especially neighboring powers and so on. They have ambitions to do that, but they're also, unlike the top three, they're also in many ways bullied and subordinate, and have to be very, very careful about how they deal with the big powers. Indeed, most of them are aligned in some way or having partnerships with one of the imperialist powers, primarily or mostly the United States of America here. And then below them, of course, are a whole range of countries. Now, what's happened is that the global economic capitalist system undergoes repeated crises of various kinds. And this has created a situation of more chaos. It's had the breakdown of the earlier sort of constitutional frameworks. And we've had a number of countries, including Russia and China, but certainly the sub-imperial powers and others, making connections and having regional associations, multilateral organizations, regional groupings, and so on, which are aimed to create a much greater space for themselves for maneuverability. But we must remember that these countries are led by capitalist ruling powers, which, of course, support the expansion of their own capitalist strength. The fact that there is greater flexibility and elsewhere they have some degree of balancing does allow for certain policies which to some extent would be favor those below in a way that would have been much more difficult if you did not have these regional groupings and multilateral agencies. But please remember that these agencies, these groupings are not serious opponents of the existing major imperialist powers. They are not serious. They are capitalist elites ruling these countries that want to maneuver here and there, but they're not serious opponents. This is important because we have to recognize that we are dealing today with fundamental problems, both domestic and international, that are in some way or the other related to capitalism. And what do I mean by that? Let me point out 5 major evils of our time. Some of them have already been mentioned. Number one, after neoliberal globalization, the increasing inequalities of income and wealth, along with the persistence of mass poverty and the steady decline of welfareism, where it was once stronger and hardly expanding elsewhere. Second, because neoliberal economics is a most right-wing form, more right-wing form than even Keynesianism and others of capitalist development, it can only stabilize itself in a world of multiple nation states, if there is a right-wing shift in ideology and politics in different nations, which takes their own particular nationalist forms. And that, in fact, is something that has been happening. And what is also happening is that these capitalist ruling classes in more authoritarian societies are also promoting a right-wing populism in opposition to efforts at left-wing populism and so on. And they are able to do so and get support because there is the playing of what I would call the politics of cultural exclusivism, centered on race, not just biologically, but anti-immigrant, if you like, on ethnicity, on religion, and of course connected to the promotion of very authoritarian exclusivist nationalisms that create a hostile other, domestic or international, that they have to fight against. The third problem is, of course, the whole question of the environmental destruction, biodiversity, climate change, the whole lot, global warming here. And even connected to that fifth, if you like, is the question of now health pandemics. And the fifth one, of course, is militarism and nuclearism. The question is that we have to fight against these resistances, and there are resistance taking place, but these resistances really can take two forms. Most of the resistances are what I would call the progressive politics of the singular. And what I mean by the progressive politics of the singular is that they tend to be specific issue struggles or specific sector struggles. Specific issues, obviously, against this company, for this demand, for that. Specific sector, for the women's movement, to support migrants, against casteism, and so on. All particular sectors, we must promote civil liberties, etc. These are specific sector movements. And they are taking place at the domestic level and to whatever extent they can at the international level. What do I mean by the politics of the universal? These are progressive politics that are centered around certain key themes that have the capacity to encompass the other struggles, because the other struggles and those struggling on specific issues, specific sector, recognized that in being part of this struggle for this larger collective demand will help their own struggles to also proceed further and succeed. And historically, we have seen three forms of the politics of the universe. One, nationalism, the struggle for national liberation, Palestine, elsewhere, for national liberation, which unified that here. Second, the struggle for democracy. And you will continue to have these struggles here. And insofar as these two struggles are against states and seek to overthrow states, and even if they take place in non-imperialist states, their knock-on effect, if it's a progressive government that comes forward, is very, very important. And you've had such successes to some extent, but they've not sufficiently stabilized themselves. You've had it in Venezuela under Chavez, you've had Ecuador, Bolivia, you've had some improvement in the economic situation, for at least some particular time. You've had democratic struggles, the Arab uprisings, and you will continue to have that because that's a part of the world in which you have dictatorships. The third politics of the universal has been the politics for socialism. And the difference between the progressive politics of pursuing socialism and that of nationalism and democracy must be understood. Nationalism, we said progressive, we have to continue to fight there because of what reactionary politics there, but always understand that there are limits to how progressive nationalism can be. There are no limits to how reactionary it can be. We have to go beyond that, even as we fight at that stage. Democracy and the struggles for democracy also operate within the same, within the nation-state form, if you like. There will be anti-capitalist currents in the struggle for progressive nationalism, and there will be anti-capitalist struggles in the struggle for democracy. But they are not necessarily central. In fact, most of the struggles for that are not necessarily socialist. But when you talk about socialism and the struggle for socialism, then your focus is very much on the question of capitalism. And the evils that I pointed out about capitalism require us to understand that we have to fight to transcend and overthrow capitalism. And the other dimension of the politics of the universal is understood as the struggle for socialism is that by its own nature, it is also more internationalist in a way that, of course, the struggle for nationalism cannot be, and even the struggle for democracy is not. And I think this is very, very important here. And indeed, efforts like the World Social Forum, the AEPF, the Progressive International are all part of this effort to actually also go beyond the national level to try to coordinate, to promote greater understanding of the need to be able to fight at this level. And yes, we have the networks of the Federation of Trade Unions, of doctors, of women's groups, of progressive environmental groups, and so on. But we have to do much more. We have to actually strengthen this, and we have to get more and more people to understand the necessity of linking their progressive struggles to this question of socialism, because the the democratic struggle and the national liberation struggle can weaken imperialism, but they're not necessarily against capitalism, and they're not directly against against imperialism, in the way that a struggle for socialism, which has to be universal and international here, is saying that we have to have a world which is not capitalist. Because today, imperialism is fundamentally connected to capitalism. And I think that is something that we have to recognize, and we have to pursue, and we have to push for. And therefore, efforts like this are important. I think I should stop there. I've tried to give a sort of general picture within 8 to 10 minutes. I apologize if I've extended beyond that, because as you know, Indians love to talk. My apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, Achin, for this broad framework and setting the paradigm for this, I think, very important webinar. Now we have Dharini. Dharini will speak on what is happening and the impact and in South Asia and in Asia, with all these protests and Gen Z protests, and how she sees that and places it. Dharini, the floor is yours. Unmute.
Okay, thank you, Anu, for that introduction, and to the organizers of this very timely discussion, given all the shifts in global power that's ongoing. I guess I'm going to sort of say a little bit about what I see to be new forms of imperialism related to digital, what I call new technologies of power, as it were. And I suppose my analysis does draw a little bit from Michel Foucault's work, because I think we need to sort of combine geopolitical analysis with also biopolitics, the control of populations through surveillance and sort of new technologies, which include digitalization across a lot of different platforms, as it were. And to talk also a little bit about resistance, but also about co-optation. And again, I think Foucault's analysis is very interesting and important, because he talks about governmentality and the way in which power and resistance coexist, and they can't somehow do without the other in that sense. And we need to see these, the way in which co-optation of resistance is always already ongoing, and then sort of figure out ways and strategies to deal with what the new kinds of colonialism that we are seeing at this time through the polycrisis, this narrative. So we are seeing new technologies of control, of course, through social media, which also enables these kinds of meetings, but also through new narratives and new forms of disinformation. And the global polycrisis I see as somewhat of a distraction, or a means by which you posit something on a global scale so that you can subvert the national and the local levels and say there are only global solutions to this issue, whether it is, and thereby erode what we used to call national sovereignty, and for which many third world countries fought battles against imperial powers. So what we see actually through also UN agencies promoting this narrative of perpetual crisis, the polycrisis, and of which COVID-19, the pandemic, was, I think, really a turning point in terms of the new technologies of power and control, because it saw a reboot, the massive transfer of wealth from within countries and across countries during that time. BlackRock, for instance, they would have had like $2 trillion given to it to sort of asset strip around the world. And we saw a digitalization on a massive scale. And so we have the COVID crisis, we have the climate disaster, and I'd like to say that when it comes to climate disasters, what used to be called development-induced disasters has now been sort of generalized to the Anthropocene. And as an anthropologist, I can say that when you look at the time of the anthropos, the human on the planet, it's a blink of an eye in geological time. And to posit that on a global scale, human beings have changed the configuration of the whole weather pattern is just, I am a climate skeptic, I have to say, on that account. I don't think it's really a viable narrative. The Anthropocene needs to be disaggregated, as it were. And we also know that, again, when it comes to new technologies, so we know now there's a lot more information that COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, which later came to be called COVID-19, was really manufactured as part of biowarfare and in different labs. And there's a long story about it. And so too, climate change, climate geoengineering has been a long in the process. From in the late 50s and 60s, the Bikini Islands explosions, nuclear and submarine submarine explosions to create tsunamis and earthquakes, leading up to now weather modification technologies and cloud seeding and flash floods and of course HARP and DEW, what's called directed energy weapons. So the staging of climate disasters is part of the climate disaster narrative. And of course, the biggest cause for climate crisis, if at all, is really the war machine, the military business industrial complex. And we see it very graphically in Gaza, the disaster, the environmental disaster it has also caused. But somehow this doesn't get mentioned in the UN discussion. So the sort of proliferation of and then of course there's the global debt crisis, which comes out of that, again, that moment of the staged COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns to basically lock down the global economy and supply chains, and that was the year that the IMF had predicted, and a lot of people had economists said that the BRICS and the aid would outgrow the G7 countries, so they would be tipping the balance, and so we have this great global lockdown of economies, smashing of supply chains, and countries' economies are put back considerably several years. So so COVID had, you can see it as a sort of bio warfare. We have and so we have this debt crisis. 56 countries now are either in IMF bailout packages or near default at this time. And these are countries that were considered emerging economies, like Sri Lanka, which had been just before the COVID been upgraded to an upper middle income country by the World Bank itself. So there's different, we might talk then about hybrid economic warfare as part of new strategies for imperialism and neo-colonialism, and of course the debt trap and the weaponization of identity politics, the culture wars that are perpetual in the background. So you're unable to distinguish what is and identify what are the real issues and what are the fake issues. And so the culture was also part of old patterns of colonialism, of divide and rule, race, ethnic, religious, caste, gender, LGBTQ, whatever it is. They're all weaponized and being used in different ways. And you have the civil societies and the NGOs and who are often funded by USAID are now discontinued, but there's NED and the National Endowment for Democracy, which famously funds a lot of these NGOs that are involved in resistance in protests. So we have also, ironically, a weaponization of research happening at this time. And but in any case, so we have this polycrisis, the debt crisis, the climate crisis, and biowarfare, and all kinds of and the pandemic and the new pandemic treaties coming into, which is all for global governance. It's a new model of global governance that will bypass the nation state. And the UN itself, I mean, the charter says nothing, Article 27, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of states. However, under the global climate crisis, under the new pandemic treaty following COVID, you have these UN agencies constantly nullifying their own charter and intervening in the domestic affairs of states. And so I think we really do need to start looking at sort of what has been called digital colonialism. Now I'm going to turn to the resistance, the problem of resistance, and which I think, again, Foucault's work is really very important because he talks about resistance being constituted through the very power structures which give rise to the resistance, and therefore the co-optation is very easy, and you see that constantly with the regime change operations that have been staged in Asia and as called Gen Z operations, but they're essentially regime change operations. They happened, I think Sri Lanka was a test case because it happened in 2012 for South Asia, but it goes back to previous regime change operations during the Arab Spring. So many countries in the Middle East had these kind of semi-staged protests. There's a lot of discontent, but then it gets mobilized to bring in regimes that are essentially favored by the global deep state. So, and then you had the color revolutions in the post-Soviet republics as well, similar. And then in South Asia, since 2022, since Sri Lanka and Pakistan simultaneously had regime change operations through protests. The famous Aragale, which was very romanticized in the social media and throughout by most social scientists. So then we had 2022 Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Now they're called Gen Z, color revolutions. Then Bangladesh in 24, Nepal 25, and then I think there has been also attempts localized in India and as well as Indonesia, and also right now we can talk about these protests, Gen Z protests across the Indian Ocean world as much as South and Southeast Asia. So Indonesia and then now Madagascar, and there's been a Gen Z protests.
Then you have a minute more.
Oh, that's all. Oh gosh. So yeah, I think there's a big issue that needs to be addressed with how these anti-corruption protesters never mention international financial corruption, which often is really the root, the supply side of the problem of inequality and corruption that they're addressing. The sovereign bonds, and the international financial system itself. And so we have this, the Gen Z protesters are all against corruption, but they only talk about local corruption. They never talk about the external actors. And once the Gen Z operation happens, the people who come in are often much worse, and they deepen the debt crisis or the corruption or whatever it is. And we're seeing that here in Sri Lanka at this time, and it's kind of in continuity with previous regime change operations. And yeah, I'll be happy to talk a little more about what happened in Sri Lanka, but and South Asia. But since my time is out right now, I'll stop.
Thank you, Dharini, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions and an opportunity to expand on some of the thoughts that you've given us here. So very much appreciated. Now we are turning to our third speaker for the session today. This is Gabriel Aguirre, who will speak on the situation in Venezuela right now, particularly around the U.S. Battleships off the coast of Venezuela, and more widely about Latin America and the threats faced by the U.S. empire, including the recent direct attacks. Gabriel, it's over to you.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much. I will apologize because my English is work in progress. So, first of all, I want to say thank you for the organizers, especially for these events, and the speakers, especially the International Peace Bureau and the Asia-Europe People's Forums, two important organizations with a great international prestige for their commitment to global peace and building a better humanity. Without a doubt, this topic that we will discuss today is great of importance in the context of the peacemaking. I believe we are all convinced that if there's a serious threat to the peace, is the existence of imperialism, which for years has promoted its agenda of war and domination against people in every corner of the world. Well, I come from a region that was named by our ancestors as Abya Yala, a place in the world like many others, where our peoples live together in peace, in harmony with nature and with all living beings. However, these regions also witnesses numerous actions carried out in the past by the European colonizing empires who devastated our indigenous peoples, and later under the tutelage and domination of the American imperialism. It will take several events like this to talk about of our history of resistance. So I want to share with you the current context that we are facing in Latin Americans. So for many years, based on the Monroe Doctrine, the theory of the manifest destiny, and the Roosevelt Corollary, the U.S. Has employed a form of relationships with our countries based on the logic of domination and hegemony. I will not dwell on explaining each of these, but I want to mention that these ideological precepts underpin the U.S. view of our region and its backyard. That's why, amid the current global tensions in the struggle of the control of strategic resource, Latin America, as you know, possesses a vast natural resource necessary for different monopolies to gain a foothold in the international competitions. Our region boasts energy, mineral, water, and biodiversity resource. To give an example of this, according to data from CEPAL, its Economy Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, this region accounts for 20% of the world's oil reserves, with Venezuela accounting for the largest amount of oil in the world, with more than 293 billion barrels of oil, Latin America also possesses around 25% of the strategic minerals. Some may have heard of the lithium triangle located between Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, which accounts for 68% of the world reserves. Bolivia, the largest water reservoir in the Guarani Aquifer in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, and Uruguay. In terms of biodiversity, among the list of the top 20 most megadiverse countries in the world are Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Venezuela. To understand the imperialism's behavior toward our countries in the world, always it's important to understand what Latin America means in the economic terms. That's why I wanted to share this data, which will help you to better understand this topic. I want to share a short video about the former General for the South Commander Laura Richardson's talking about the current policy of the US for Latin Americans.
Gabriel, we don't have sound.
Oh, we haven't sound?
No sound, no. Creo que tienes que compartir nuevamente y asegurar hacer clic en el botón donde dice compartir también el sonido.
Ah, ok, perfecto, listo. Voy, ahora sí.
This region matters with all of its rich resources and rare earth elements. You've got the lithium triangle, which is needed for technology today. 60% of the world's lithium is in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. You just have the largest oil reserves, light sweet crude, discovered off of Guyana over a year ago. You have Venezuela's resources as well with oil. Copper, gold. We have the Amazon, lungs of the world. We have 31% of the world's fresh water in this region too. I mean, it's just off the charts. We have a lot to do. This region matters. It has a lot to do with national security, and we need to step up our game.
Well, this short video, you can see when she say that our resource, okay, so we need to protect that, we need to try to work on that, etc., etc., etc. They feel like the owner of this resource. So I will now like to address a very specific situation that has been escalated in the recent weeks, specifically of the US military deployment in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela, where it has deployed more than 10,000 troops belonging to the 4th Fleet and the South Commander. This is, of course, part of the strategy of the militarization of the entire regions where the US has a large number of military bases. This is unprecedented deployment of military troops in these regions includes, in addition to military personnel, the presence of the warships, nuclear-capable submarine, missile launchers, helicopters, and other military equipment that will allow to US to carry out military operations against Venezuela by land or by air and at any time. The argument that has been used as in previous years based on a false narrative has been the supposed fight against drug trafficking. I want to share a fact that allows to us to understand that is a big lie, and that is that according to the latest United Nations report on drugs issues, says that the 85% of the drugs that go to the US from Latin Americans are transported across the Pacific Oceans, not the Caribbean Sea. Of course, US imperialists know this very well. a few days before of all of about these situations, like the all West style military deployment. The U.S. announced a bounty for the capture of the constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, once again demonstrating it continues to consider itself the worst policeman, believing itself to have the right to announce the arrest of presidents a sovereign country. Well, during the military deployment, the U.S. has announced the summary execution with missiles through kinetic attacks of people who have traveled in boats through the Caribbean Sea under the alleged accusation of being boats with drops. There have already been more than 5 attacks with numbers dead, of which not evidence has been presented with the identity of these people, with the seizure of mercancy, and the contrary, the U.S. has presented is a great achievement in the supposed fight against drug trafficking. Many Latin American countries have spoken against these unilateral actions that violate the international law. A couple of days ago, Donald Trump, as a spokesperson of for the imperialism, announced that he was authorizing the CIA operations in Venezuela, also in something never seen before, publicly announcing that the U.S. government's intelligence agency will carry out operations on Venezuela territory. Of course, as a consequence of these aggressions, emergency meetings of the... Sorry? Okay. The UN Security Council have been called to war of an imminent military aggression by the US against Venezuela. Everything seems to indicate that once again the US intends to start a war under a false excuse, just as it did in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the supposed weapons of mass destructions that they have never showed to the war. This is what they are doing with the case of Venezuela, a country to which more than 1,000 unilateral coercion measures have been applied to strangle the economy and create pressure on the country for a forced regime change. So we are undoubtedly facing a flagrant violation of the international law, of the principle of the respect for the sovereignty and the self-determination of the peoples. No one has granted U.S. imperialists the right to treat in global peace and regional stability. Latin America is and must continue to be a zone of peace, as was proclaimed in 2014. From the peace movement, we will continue working for the closure of all military bases, for the dismantling the South Commander and the Fourth Fleet, and for the defense of the right of our people to live in peace and build independent future. Our people have a long history of resistance and courage, and we are proud of it. Let's all work to end all wars and imperialism and build a world of peace, solidarity, and social justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this very important assessment, because we are also worried about Latin America and the assault, which is directly being, every day in the news you see what the American regime is planning and targeting Venezuela and others. And now for our last and most very important speaker, Christophe. Christophe will speak on his analysis of imperialism and also some specifics on what is happening in Europe. Thank you, Christophe. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with all of you and very interested by the first speaker's speeches, who were very good and useful, in my opinion. But I want to start by the first at all, the big picture. Second thing, what Trump and the administration of the U.S. government change in the world today, and the consequences in particular in Europe with the resistance. First at all, about the big picture, I will be relatively short because Achin said the most important thing. I totally agree with him. But I want to focus on one of the most important theory, in my opinion, which is the world system theory, was created by Immanuel Wallerstein, the American sociologist, but also people like Samir Amin, the very important activist from Egypt, and a lot of others, who explain very well that from the 16th century to now, you have always in the world one state who control the world system. There was the Netherlands in the 16th and beginning of 17th century, then the British after a big war with the French, and then the American after the First World War. But each time in those big periods where you have a competition because all those different powers at their decline, you have a period of instability who open the door for new actors who try to play a most important role. It was very clear during the decline of the British domination, where the Japanese, the German, the Russian try to become as well a main competitor. And we are living in the same situation today. There is, of course, the US as the main power at world level. That's not discussion on that. But at the same time, there is a decline of the capacity of the US to control the world and the rise of China as a main competitor at all the levels, economical, military, diplomatic. And this competition between China and the US create the possibility for other actors to try to play a role as a sort of sub-imperialism or proto-imperialism or whatever we use as a terminology. And those actors are mainly Russia, who tried to recreate what was the old empire of the Tsar, trying to intervene in the Caucasus and today in Ukraine. But you have also other countries close to Europe or part of Europe. Look at Turkey, for example. Turkey today tried to recreate not exactly the old Turkish empire, which would be, of course, totally impossible, but to intervene in a lot of places. The former Turkish empire, like Syria, where the Turkish are very important today, in Libya, but also in the Middle East, in Asia, like in Azerbaijan against Armenia, or all the Turkophone countries in the Middle Asia. And Turkey tried to play this role. And that's created a very unstable situation at worldwide level, which explained the instability and the volatility of the today situation all over the world. The second big picture, which is important to focus on, is the fact that the capacity of the states is still very important, in particular at military level, but which more limit than in the past. The rise of the civil society for the last 50, 60 years, it's really impressive. Look at the fact, for example, that no one of the big power was able to win a war after the Second World War. Look at the US. The US was defeated everywhere. Of course, in Vietnam, but also in Iraq. They were obliged also to withdraw from Syria. They were not able to impose their power, or Afghanistan. Same for Russia. Russia was obliged to withdraw from Afghanistan before the US, and today they are totally incapable to win in Ukraine and to change the regime in Ukraine, which was the main reason and the main element of the decline, the start of the war 3 years ago. And it's true for every country. France was today expelled from most of the African countries, which is a good thing, by the way, even if the regime who were replacing the French influence are not always the best. That's not the point, but at least that show that this kind of sub-imperialism are today incapable to maintain their power everywhere. But in each of our countries, we have a lot of elements, like the increase of the level of education everywhere. The youth have access to superior education in the north as well as in the south. We have also the power of the media and the capacity to know what happened everywhere in the world. Look at the Gaza. we know what happened there because we have a media from Al Jazeera and a lot of others. It's not to support Qatar, it's not my point, but make able everyone to look at what's happening, plus the social media who have the double aspect of defunding and propaganding all the crazy theory and try to impose the biopolitic we were talking about before me, but also the capacity for the people of social movement and the people in general to create their own agenda and to mobilize themselves through those new tools. And now that's the big picture. Now, what Trump is changing, I think Trump is changing two things. The first thing, which is the most obvious, I will be very short on that, is to even increase the instability of the world by this tariff war everywhere against India, against China, Europe, everywhere, and the capacity to destroy all the international institutions and to attack the climate negotiation and all those very important international sphere and place where we try to resolve the problem of the humanity, like the climate change, for example. That's obvious. But there is a second thing Trump is doing, and that is generally less discussed. In the beginning of the neoliberal globalization in the 90s, the main power, it was Clinton at this time in the US, but the equivalent in Europe with Tony Blair and a lot of others, there was a sort of proposal of an alliance between the big capital, the big bourgeoisie, the main leaders of the world, with a sort of emerging middle class. And they use the term like a creative class or startup nation and a lot of terminology of this kind would show at this time that it was necessary to have a ecological friendly approach, to have the capacity to struggle against climate change. We have to be gay friendly. We have to open to feminism, to the right of minority, open also to a certain level of migration. If you look today at the big tech in the US, the Indian engineers are absolutely key. Without them, you don't have neither Google, Amazon, or other big tech of this kind. And this proposal was the neoliberal leadership proposal in the 90s and in the 2000s, is today challenged by a new political proposal, which is the Trump proposal, but also the new authoritarianism we see today in a lot of places in the world, of course in the north, but also in the south, which is the idea that you need to have a sort of false alliance between the big capitalism, like Elon Musk in the US, which is a little bit the symbol of that, but also the popular and the working class. And to do that, what they do is to attack not only the migrant and the migration in general, but also they attack the woman and feminism, they attack the LGBTQ, they attack the intellectual, they attack the people who are fighting for the ecological issues and against the climate change. And they try to create a sort of authoritarianism and authoritarian regime who are focusing on this attack against the middle class in favor of this so-called alliance between the big capital and the popular class. That's created a big division among the developed country and inside the society, like Europe, but also in Japan or Korea. If you look what happened really recently in South Korea, it was exactly this issue on the table. And in Europe today, we have a big fight between the people who are supported by Trump or even Putin, who try to develop this conspiracy theory and to support the far right and the fascist and neo-fascist group in Europe. And in front of that, the problem we have as social movements and working class and popular class is to have to fight against two fronts, if you want. One, it's against neoliberalism, that's obvious, but also against this new attempt to create authoritarian regime, as we saw in Hungary, as we saw in a lot of countries where we had this kind of attempt to create a new illiberal authoritarian regime today. And I want only to finish by the fact, and there's maybe a little debate among us, the panelists, about what the Gen Z is. If we look at what I know the most, except Europe, which is Africa, in Africa, we have two countries where the Gen Z is very important. Madagascar, they were able to sack the president. You saw that recently in the news, but also Morocco, where you have a lot of movements today with a lot of demonstration of young people. When you look at their demands, they are social issues. They are fighting for more public service. They are fighting for employment. They are fighting for better wages for the workers. I think they are our people. And I really think, in my opinion, that we have to support and to be with them because they are really the actor, the young generation who can change the game and change the world. For this reason, I am more positive about this kind of new generation of movement, which was very important during the Arab Spring, even if today we have a backlash in a lot of countries. Of course, Egypt and others. But I think that what happened today with the Gen Z, it's one hope in this world. I finish with that. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Christophe. I think Anu was supposed to come in here, but I think she might have had a distraction. So just I'll come in the meantime to thank you real quick. Um, that concludes our first round of comments from the speakers. Now we will turn briefly to some exchange or questions for one another as well. We each will give you each about 3 to 4 minutes to respond to the comments that have been shared by the others. And I think the first one we will start with is to Achin.
I think, Achin, your response? You're muted. We can't hear. No. You have to unmute.
Trying to unmute.
Yeah, you're unmuted now. We can hear.
Sorry.
Just a 2-minute response.
What's happened now? I'm sorry, I'm really
No,
illiterate.
Achin, if you want to respond to the other speakers or ask them any questions, then you have 2 minutes.
I'm out. Sorry, I'm out. I can't. Can you see me?
Yes.
I can't see anything.
We can see and hear you quite well.
Yeah, I really don't know what's happened over here because there's been so much of a mess up of my electricity. Can you just ask me later? Let me
Sure,
see if I
we
can
can come back to you,
Okay.
and we'll go on
hope
next
so. I don't know what's
to Darini then.
Darini, would you like to respond to the other speakers or ask them any questions or make any final comments?
Yeah, I guess I should sort of continue where I sort of left off in some ways, but to respond to the last speaker's comments about Gen Z, my sort of point is that the Gen Z protests are not really organic, or they're partially organic, but highly streamed by external actors through the GAFAM, I mean, social media platforms, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, TikTok. These were leaderless Gen Z. And Gen Z is it's an Euro American neologism. It doesn't sort of really make much sense in South Asia at some level. But also they were, the protests in Sri Lanka triggered with Victoria Nuland's visit in March 2022 to kick off the Aragalia, the protests. And she, as we know, she was the undersecretary for the State Department at the time, and she was at the Maidan Square protests in Ukraine. She famously said, "Fuck the EU," which was caught on tape at that time. when they were, we know that the CIA was behind the protests at the Maidan Square, which eventually led to the installation of an actor, Zelensky, to fight the proxy war, the NATO proxy war on Russia. So this Gen Z protests, they're leaderless, they're sort of choreographed through remote platforms. They lead to sabotage of their own countries and their own futures. So if you see what the outcome of what happened after the protests is that the IMF essentially takes over. So the protests were staged to have a regime change, bring in a pro-IMF, and I myself personally saw protesters holding pro-IMF posters in Sri Lanka during the protests. And so they bring in a regime that says there is no alternative to the IMF. We have to go into their restructure programs, which is austerity, privatization of national assets, and basically deepening the debt trap. And I mean, we expect now that there will be a second default in 2028 when the country has to start paying back the capital on the to the secret bondholders and the vulture funds, BlackRock being the largest, who holds Sri Lanka's debt. So in fact, the protesters made their own future worse, because the next generations now will have to pay off this new debt that has been accumulated through the debt restructure, which is the biggest bond scam yet. It has deepened the debt, and it has also extended the period, so future generation. So the Aragalia, so I'm sorry to say, whereas we would love to actually place our faith in the protests, and I think the whole sort of social science, there is a romanticization of these Gen Z protests, and there is a lot of frustration, it is true. However, they get streamed and they are choreographed and controlled by external actors who deepen their own ability and their interest to draw out the natural resources, the wealth of third world countries through these, what Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine. You deliver shocks to countries through Aragaliers or regime change operations, and then you exploit them. The rise of disaster. Naomi Klein's book is called The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. So that's what we see, the staging of, and so ironically, these protests have in fact led to more, and they're sabotaging their own futures. There's a lot of social disruption, economic disruption. Look at what happened in Nepal. When Google, Facebook, the social media, and TikTok was shut down, the deep state, the global deep state, issued a warning to the Nepalese government. If you shut it down, you're going to get burnt down. So the parliament was burnt down, ministers were attacked, the Supreme Court the courts were attacked, court records destroyed. So you're basically sabotaging your future. So, and the future of the country. So, and this deepens the ability of external actors to exploit these countries, and deepens. But the point is that the role of social media becomes almost sacrosanct. You threaten Google, GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, TikTok. You shut them down, you're going to get it bad. So I think we need to be much less romantic about protests, as Michel Foucault was quite rightly. See how biopolitics, the control of populations through new technologies of surveillance, digitalization, and now we're going to have CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. We're going to have digital identities, identity cards, etc. So the whole tracking process, all of that is now being rolled out slowly for global governance. And these shocks and the Gen Z, so we see the appropriation of resistance, the cooptation of resistance by the structures of power. And that is why I think we really need to be putting in geopolitical, bringing back Foucault's biopolitical analysis into the analysis of geopolitics to understand the diffusion of new forms of governmentality and neocolonialism, as it were. Thank you.
Gabriel, would you like to come in here before then Christoph and then Achin if he's got his internet back? So, Gabriel?
Sí. I want to speak in Spanish. If Sean could help me to say something.
I'll try to do a interpretation consecutively. So after you speak, I'll try to summarize it.
Yo creo que en general el imperialismo, su objetivo no ha cambiado durante todos los años de su existencia.
Bueno.
Voy a ser corto para traducir.
Yeah, that helps. That helps. So Gabriel says that in general he believes that imperialism has remained a constant over the years.
Seguimos observando que su principal objetivo es el control de los recursos estratégicos en todos los lugares del mundo.
We see that its principal or main goal is the control of strategic resources all around the world.
Y para eso trata de ejercer todas las presiones desde el enfoque político, económico, diplomático y militar.
And in pursuit of this, it uses all pressure points it can, including political, economic, military, social, and so on and so forth.
Gran parte del contexto que señala Darini sobre lo que está sucediendo en Asia sería perfectamente el mismo contexto de lo que pudiera estar ocurriendo en África o en América Latina.
The larger context that Darini had mentioned in her last intervention is the same that we see in other parts of the world, be it Africa, Latin America, or otherwise.
¿Qué elementos en común existen? La militarización de las regiones, la promoción de golpes de Estado a gobiernos que le son incómodos a los objetivos del imperialismo.
It uses coup d'états, protests, and other actions to destabilize governments in order to exert control.
La utilización de distintas herramientas desde la tecnología, pasando por las armas, pasando por estrategias en el campo económico, todas con un mismo objetivo: cómo debilitar a los estados nacionales y sobre la base de eso poder hacerse de una forma más fácil del control de esos recursos estratégicos que están en ese país.
It uses all the tools at its disposal in order to weaken national states, in order to have different methods of obtaining or gaining access to their resources.
Y el imperialismo no le interesa extender y promover una guerra a escala local, regional e inclusive mundial, con el afán, con el único objetivo de poder hacerse el control de esos recursos de ese país.
And it's willing to include war of any scale, whether it be local levels, regional levels, or global levels, in order to meet these goals.
Ahora, hemos hablado de lo que hace el imperialismo, pero también es importante hacer mención a la resistencia que se está creando desde los pueblos.
So we've been speaking a lot today about imperialism, but we can't forget to mention also the resistance of the peoples.
La guerra en Gaza ha demostrado el verdadero rostro criminal, genocida que tiene el imperialismo.
The genocide in Gaza has revealed the true face of this imperialism in its worst and most extreme forms.
Y cada vez más personas están tomando conciencia de esa realidad global.
And every day, more and more people are realizing the extent of this imperialism and the disasters it brings.
Y las personas y los movimientos se organizan en función de oponerse a la promoción de la guerra, de oponerse a la dominación, de oponerse a la recolonización.
And the peoples and movements of the world organize themselves in opposition to these wars, to this expansion of the imperialist projects.
Nosotros creemos que es fundamental que nuestros pueblos, en la lógica de la resistencia no violenta, trabajen en tres grandes áreas de acción.
The movement against wars and imperialism organizes around three central areas.
La principal, una educación para la paz, pedagogía para la paz.
So the first
Poder
one,
hablar y crear conciencia de lo que está sucediendo. Un ejemplo de eso es este webinar.
so first to just take a step back, I forgot to include the word in the last translation, nonviolent reactions to the situation. The first one that Gabriel outlines is education for peace. And that can include, for example, the webinar that we're having here today.
La segunda tiene que ver con el activismo, con la movilización, con las acciones de protesta pacífica y no violentas.
The second one is the activism that we see, the demonstrations and activities around the world calling for peace.
Y el tercer gran eje de trabajo tiene que estar centrado en la labor en los medios de comunicación, en las redes sociales.
And the third one is the importance of using all tools at our disposal, particularly the media, and including social medias, to spread the message of nonviolence and opposition to imperialism and war.
Finalmente, construir estrategias de unidad en la diversidad, plataformas de acción común para oponerse al imperialismo, que es el principal promotor de guerras en el mundo, resistir y salir victoriosos.
And finally, we need to come together with unity in diversity and tackling the issue from various perspectives and angles and working together with a global community against these initiatives while also addressing the local issues and opposing the primary forces of imperialism like the US.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
So we can have Christoph now, and then after that, Achin with his last comments. Christoph?
Yes, now a few words about the new social movements. I think that it will be a mistake to see all the new movements as a sort of proxy from the imperialism, in particular from the US or the Western imperialism. If you look at Africa and the two countries I was talking about, Madagascar, the president who was sacked by the mobilization was supported by France and was exfiltrated from Madagascar to the Réunion and to Dubai by the French army. And the movement, if there is one power who tried to play a role on supporting this new movement, Gen Z, is Russia, who try, like in other African countries, to impose a new presence of the Russian mercenaries, the Wagner groups and this kind of groups. But that's totally secondary. The movement in Madagascar is a genuine movement of the youth for public services and social issues. In Morocco, it's even more clear. The movement started because in Agadir, a city of the south of the country, there was an hospital where 8 women were there because they were pregnant to give birth to babies. Those 8 women died because the public service was not able to help them, because the doctors were not there, because the public service was so destroyed by the neoliberal policy that they were not able to survive from that. And it's because of this shock that the youth in Morocco was uprising itself and organized this big Gen Z movement. And you have to know that the power in Morocco, the king and the government, is the main ally of the US and European power. It's the support of imperialism. It's not at all the movement which is supported by imperialism, but the power of Morocco, which is challenged by this new movement of Gen Z in Morocco. I don't know what will happen in this country, but the movement is extremely important for the future of this country. But more generally, and I think that the thing we should discuss is the fact that there is a new way of commit and a new way of be part of the social action and the politics today from the youth. I don't know how the things are in India today, but in Europe, the unions and the political party are very weak today. But at the same time, the movement are very strong. And the people who are part of those movements don't want to be part of parties and unions for most of them. Personally, I regret it because, as you can see in this video, I'm not a young guy. And I am part of political parties. I am part of union. I am a unionist, and I defend the necessity of union and political party. But we have to know that it's not the way in which most of the new people who are mobilizing themselves in supporting Gaza or supporting the social issues in Europe, for example, don't want to be part of those unions and those left political parties. They can vote time to time for them, but they organize themselves in a new way through the social media, through informal network. And we have a new generation starting with the movement, the Occupy Wall Street 15 years ago, which is now the way in which the climate activists, for example, were key in the flotilla for Gaza when they organized themselves with their own resources without passing through organization to try to mobilize today for Gaza. And when you look at the situation in Italy, where you have a huge movement in supporting Gaza, most of them are organized directly by local groups and the people who are not organized in the way we were 50 years ago. And I'm not happy about that because it's not my personal culture. But we have to live with and to be able to have bridges and links with those people because they are the future of the world. And I really think that we have to start by being sympathetic for this young movement and what was happening, even in Maidan, for example, in Ukraine. I was with them. There was not the CIA organizing that. That it's really a conspiracy theory, in my personal opinion. Maidan was a genuine movement of the young people who wanted their country to be more free, more modern, less corrupt. Then, of course, the CIA was happy about, but they didn't start this movement. And that's true all over the world. I think that the idea that you have a sort of conspiracy organizing, it's not the reality of what's happening. And even if it's uncomfortable, and I think it is, because those new movements are not easy to manage, if you want, we have to live with and to be able to open the arms and to work with them because they are the future of our countries. That's what I wanted to develop. And sorry if it was a little bit long. Thanks a lot.
Achin, you have to unmute. We can't hear you. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, we have a bit of a problem. Our host here seems
I can't. I've got it now.
there
we
you
can
go.
hear you
Okay.
now.
I can hear you. Yeah. Actually, coming from the same generation or even older than Christophe, I actually agree with what he says here about young people today not being inclined towards moving towards some kind of party type structure or organized, and of course, being very strongly influenced by social media, whose strength is that you can bring people together very quickly to create a very powerful event and development. But I wonder whether this is the same as being able to actually build cadres through face-to-face activity and grassroots activity here. And there are people, young people, who are doing this kind of grassroots activity, prolonged activity in specific sectors and on specific issues. But you have to bring them all together in some particular way. In the case of our enemy, the oppressors and the capitalist classes, the mechanism by which they are able to provide a kind of larger vision and to provide a kind of control mechanism and to try to unify these oppressive forces to strengthen themselves and the capitalist class as a whole is the state. And whether we like it or not, the most important organizational form in history for pursuing what I call the politics of the universal has been parties, or united front of parties. Because what parties do, they are like a spread. They have cadres here, there, everywhere. and they try to bring them together within one framework for discussion, development, and so on, etc. Here. The alternative organizational form to something like this would be what people like Castells and others talk about, a network or a network of networks. And it doesn't really work in order to provide that kind of collective vision which people adhere to, or an organizational structure that can fight on this front and all towards that here. We can see it in the Indian case, where the most important effort to build a kind of network of progressive movements and others is the NAPM, the National Alliance of People's Movement. So I think this is one very important point here, that one can understand that the young generation doesn't feel that it has anything to learn from the older generation in terms of its history and so on, who nowadays even talks about an international of political parties as distinct from an international of certain this movement and that movement and all the rest of it. And yet I believe that this still remains crucially important, because for all the work that Foucault has done in reminding us about capillary power through classification of governmentality and creating subjectivities, it tends to strongly underestimate that even as there are so many institutions and forms of the generation of socialization of subjectivities, of therefore power and knowledge, there is still a special place for the state. And here I come to the question about what Weber and Marx both emphasize. And here the important thing is that there are various ways in which you can shape people, that is to say, restrict or eliminate their freedom of agency. Because that's in a certain sense what governmentality and all the rest of it do. But remember that the state, which has a monopoly of physical force, and there's a difference between coercion and force. Coercion is about, of course, restricting the agency, eliminating the freedom of agency. But force eliminates the freedom of agency by eliminating the agent itself through force. And that's what states have. And these days, everywhere, unlike even in the Western countries and the European countries of social democracy and elsewhere, now states which earlier were much more reluctant to resort to domestic struggles with force are much more willing to resort to force, even in the most advanced social democratic countries or the advanced Western countries. And that's something that we have to really understand in order to take that. My own view is about social media, very good, etc. But it's part of a whole process of atomization of people in so many different ways, not spending enough time with each other, building the kind of solidarities that. I was supposed to be first. I have actually two questions, both for Christoph and for Gabrielle. For the last 15, 20 years, the continent that gave us hope, or some hope, where left populism emerged and all that, was South America. And you had in Venezuela, you had for the first time the armed apparatuses of the state moving in a more progressive direction, something like Portugal in 1974-75. And Chavez was there. And he made changes here. But why did it fail? Because Maduro is not like that at all here. Of course, we criticize the United States and everything here. And what happened? One, of course, maybe the emphasis on extractivism all. But what about ALBA and the efforts that were there to try to build that? I would like to know a little bit more, even in brief, about why that failed. And what happened? Because you have a degeneration there. Extractivism, reliance on that also meant changes there. For Christoph, today, if you look at the advanced countries and much of Europe, the state which gives you, the country that gives you some little bit of hope is where you have Mélenchon and Insoumis as a strong force in a way that now Syriza and others are not. Maybe the left front Portugal here. So can you say something about what are the possibilities and what you would like to see as the direction in which it will move? Because I do feel one thing. If there is a strong left critical of capitalism, even if it's capitalism, government that comes to power in an advanced state, its knock-on effect will be very considerable. It can generate the kind of forces that can move even further. So I'm asking you really, in a sense, what are the possibilities of the one big left force in Europe or left party of some just like social or whatever, moving ahead and changing the picture in France.
Thank you, Achin. And that is also a perfect transition into our final segment for today, which is our Q&A. So we already have two questions posed, one to Gabriel and one to Christophe. Would either of you like to answer first? And Gabriel, if you'd like a translation of the question, you let me know.
Bien, yo, bueno, voy a hablar todo otra vez en español. Lo primero que diría a Chica es que necesitamos otro webinar para responder la pregunta que hizo.
So thank you very much for the question. And my first answer is that we would need a whole other webinar in order to answer your question.
Porque es hablar sobre la cuestión de Venezuela en mayor profundidad y de América Latina en general. Y eso toma bastante tiempo para poder comprenderlo en su justa dimensión.
Perdón, ¿puedes repetir? No, no pude.
Sí, a ver, porque esto implica hablar de Venezuela en profundidad y de América Latina, y esto nos llevaría bastante tiempo para poder trabajarlo adecuadamente.
So this we would have to go into depth on the story and situation in Venezuela, but also more widely, of course, across the continent. And this would take quite a bit of time to get into.
Voy a mencionar algunas cosas muy breves. Yo creo que América Latina sigue siendo un continente de esperanza.
So I'll mention a few things here, anyways. And the first is that South America is and should remain a continent of hope.
En nuestros pueblos y particularmente en nuestros países latinoamericanos, yo no considero que hayan fracasado. Considero que seguimos resistiendo estoicamente, valientemente.
Our peoples and our countries, it should be noted, continue to resist. Historically and actually, culturally, we are resisting.
Y respeto los criterios y los análisis que puedan tener sobre los contextos particulares de cada país en el mundo. Pero quienes estamos aquí en América Latina sabemos la gran historia de resistencia que tiene nuestro pueblo.
So, of course, there are stories all around the world, there are experiences all around the world, but in Latin America in particular, we have this strong tradition and history of resistance.
Alguien decía, ¿por qué las luchas populares son más complicadas y más difíciles en América Latina que en otros lugares del mundo? Son más complejas que en África, que en el Medio Oriente, que en Asia.
So people ask, why is it the popular resistance in Latin America is more complex, more difficult, more intense than in other parts of the world?
Y la razón es una, y está clara, es porque estamos en el mismo área geográfica que el imperialismo más agresivo y más brutal de la humanidad.
And the answer is quite simple. It's because we are in the same region of the world, quite close to the main empire that we have in this moment, the United States.
Y la presión contra nuestros países es en todas las esferas. Es una presión, voy a hablar en el caso de Venezuela. La presión es política, es económica, es diplomática y ahora también es militar.
And we face the entire spectrum of imperialist policies and practices in our continent, political, economic, diplomatic, and of course, most recently, military.
En el caso de Venezuela hay que analizar dos Venezuelas. La Venezuela previa a las sanciones, a las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, y la Venezuela después de las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, que fueron aplicadas en el año 2014.
So in Venezuela, we have to look at two Venezuelas in particular, the Venezuela before and after sanctions. The sanctions that took place in 2014, in particular, the economic sanctions, which completely changed the context in Venezuela.
Sin las sanciones, Venezuela era capaz de garantizarle a su población educación pública gratuita de calidad, una salud pública y universal, el acceso a derechos como la vivienda, el acceso a derechos económicos y sociales, uno de los salarios mínimos más altos del continente y diversos programas sociales para la atención de la población.
Before the sanctions, you can look at the incredible economy in Venezuela, including the free public education for all, universal health care, universal right to housing, the highest salaries in South America at the time, among others,
Y, y otros derechos económicos y sociales.
and other social and economic rights.
Después de las sanciones, con Estados Unidos cortándole el 99% de los ingresos al país,
So after the sanctions, the US managed to cut nearly 99% of all of the income sources for the country.
la gestión gubernamental, las políticas públicas y la posibilidad de gobernar, por supuesto que se complejiza y se caotiza en general.
The capacities for governance, for administration in the country were completely put into a chokehold and unable to function as they used to.
La capacidad de seguir construyendo alianzas y espacios de integración regional te obliga necesariamente a concentrarte en los esfuerzos de gobernanza interna y no tanto externa, no tanto internacional, un poco para responder sobre el tema de el ALBA y otros mecanismos de integración.
So to respond a bit about your question, particularly around ALBA, the sanctions also strongly weakened the capacities of Venezuela in order to engage and to strengthen the interregional approach.
Pero además el imperialismo tomó distintas acciones para intentar liquidar estos esfuerzos de integración regional. Dio un golpe de Estado en Honduras contra el presidente Zelaya, dio un golpe de Estado en Paraguay, promovió intentos también de desestabilización en Brasil, en Bolivia y en distintos países que estaban tratando de integrar y sacar adelante el esfuerzo de integración regional.
More widely in the continent, we've seen the US's efforts to weaken the states coming together, whether it be the coups that took place in Honduras, in Paraguay, or other destabilization activities in Brazil, Bolivia, and so on and so forth. These were deliberate strategies by the empire to weaken the interconnection of the countries of Latin America.
Y en el caso de Venezuela, como lo decía, aplicaron sanciones, promovieron golpes de Estado contra el país, nombraron un gobierno paralelo contra Venezuela, introdujeron mercenarios, terroristas al país. Y por último, que es la más reciente ofensiva de agresión, bueno, han movilizado 10.000 tropas al Caribe con un submarino con capacidad nuclear, 3 buques de guerra, han autorizado operaciones en tierra por parte de la CIA. Es decir, es una ofensiva a escala global en el caso de Venezuela.
Thank you.
In the case of Venezuela in particular, we see, among other things, the coup promotion, attempts for coups in the country, parallel governments being set up, the introduction of mercenaries into Venezuela from the US, aggression in particularly now, the actions we're seeing of the US military with 10,000 troops and their military vessels just off the coast, the threats of CIA and their involvement in Venezuela as well, among others. So this is what we're seeing why Venezuela continues in the continuing trend of the US to increase and to build up the pressure against Venezuela.
Cierro con esto. La Alianza Popular y las fuerzas populares en Venezuela y en América Latina seguimos resistiendo. No fracasamos. Seguimos resistiendo junto a nuestro pueblo y estamos seguros que el destino inexorable de nuestros pueblos es la victoria.
So I close with the final message that the popular resistance continues to grow, that we stand strongly in opposition to these trends, and this resistance will succeed in the end. We will not cave in to the U.S. empire. Thank you, Gabriel. I think there was also then the question Achin posed to Christophe.
Oh, I can answer very briefly. It's true that in France we have the chance to have a radical left, which is important, but not enough to win alone. Because if you look at the strengths, the opinion polls show that the left altogether it's around 30 to 35%, which is relatively good because we have in Europe a situation when the classic parties were running Europe for the last 70 years, Social Democrat in one hand and Conservative in the other hand, are more and more weak. And all the elections show the weakness of those classic running parties, Social Democrats and conservative, classic conservative. And what we have in all Europe, it's a rise both of the fascist, neo-fascist, authoritarian, xenophobic, name them as you want, everywhere. In France, they are supposed to have more than 35% of the vote at the next election, which is enormous. They win in Italy, of course. You saw that with Meloni. They are very strong in Germany as well. They are rising today in Britain a lot with the big anti-migrant racist movement of Farage. But in the other hand, you have also a rise of the radical left. Mélenchon, as you said, in France, but also in Germany. The good news of the last election was the rise of the Link party, the left party, who was supposed to disappear and who got almost 10%, which is good in this context. In the UK, we'll see what Corbyn is able to do with his new party, because, of course, he didn't run for election until now, but it's possible that the things are more positive. But when you look at the big picture, sadly, it's more the rise of the extreme right, which is the main element, than the rise of the left. In France, we are half and half, which is good, 35-35, and only 30 for the classic running parties. But the problem of the left, it's also how we can have a unity of the left, because we have not only the France Insoumise with Mélenchon, which is credited of 12%, more or less, a little bit like Die Linke in Germany, but also the communists, the Green, who are more left in France than in Germany, and also the socialists, who are divided between the classic social democrat and a wing which is more left. That is the main challenge. I will not enter into detail because it will be too long and it's not the point of this webinar, but it's more or less the reality in all Europe. This rise of the far right is the main element and is sadly the result, but also a rise of the radical left more or less everywhere, with up and down. Podemos almost disappear in Spain. Syriza, you know, the situation is not good at all. But globally, you have these two rise, extreme right and radical left. But sadly, today is more the extreme right who has the hand. Thanks.
Thanks, and we're really running out of time. We've gone really over, but there is a consensus in the chat that we need a part 2 of this webinar, and maybe IPB and AEPF can do that after a while. So I'll leave it to Sean to now, and there's an interesting comment in the chat also, but not a question. So I leave it to Sean now to really wind up and close. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a challenge to close such an interesting and diverse webinar in a succinct manner that also provides us some hope in terms of the future. So I'll try to keep it quite short also because we're over time. The challenges of the empire, which of course the empire itself can be defined in a number of ways. I think we've seen a couple definitions here which aren't mutually exclusive either. There's a lot of overlap in definitions, but whichever definition we take, they are the empire or empires that we see utilize a wide range of tools and coercion in order to continue their ruling class empires on the global stage, including, of course, the economic, military, political, diplomatic, and other levers of power. We see that even when it comes to popular resistance and protests, there are threats to popular resistance movements and the co-optation of these movements by the empire, particularly now in the realm of online digital networks and social media. We see that this domination is not limited to any one geographical space, but really is across the spectrum. And we see that it is led by the interests of maintaining a neoliberal order that benefits some at the expense of others and includes, of course, mineral and resource exploitation and imperialism within the process. There are still some challenges or maybe opportunities for changes to this imperialism, as was outlined a bit by Professor Achin at the beginning, including the middle powers and including some regional groupings. But we recognize at this point these groupings are not able to fully challenge the domination and hegemony of the imperialist system that is maintained. So there's a lot of work for us to do across social movements, and as written in the chat, this cannot be limited to any one movement. This is not a peace movement. This is not an economic justice movement, or even purely an anti-imperialist movement. It's one that requires all of our forces to come together because the challenge ahead of us is so severe. The first part, of course, is the education and recognizing what it is that's ahead of us and to have these conversations like we've had today. So we thank you all for being here with us. We will have next steps and work towards further webinars and other events to continue this discussion beyond today. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you to Anu as my co-host and someone who put a lot of work into putting all of this together. I really appreciate that, Anu. Thank you to Cora, who's with us as well. And of course to all of you for being with us.